What's up, DS3 TV? We are back for another video. This one is Sarcastic Productions video. This one is History Summarized Britain. This is their newest video, so I wanted to watch it as soon as it came out. And gonna have this as one video so that we know it isn't recommended, but it should be here. So yeah, let's get into it and subscribe to the channel when you get 1,000 subscribers by my birthday, September 13th. And also recommend me videos down in the comment section down below. Because, this is going to be really, really good. And play.
British history is famously kind of impossible. The individual sagas of the Isles up to 1600 were already plenty complex on their own, but after England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland become a geopolitical megazord, those stories interlock, and then things get really tricky. But that's just the British part, because we also have the little subject of their empire, as the following 4 centuries see a globe-trotting whirlwind of exploration and colonization that culminates in the single most cartoonishly humongous empire in human history. So in a noble but fundamentally doomed attempt to recount the interwoven stories of Britain and her empire, let's do some history. When last we left the Isles, Scotland's King James inherited the English crown in 1603 and luckily avoided being exploderized by the diabolical John Johnson and his fellow gunpowder junkies. Their plan was certainly extreme and their idiocy was correspondingly immense, but their religiously motivated discontent was broadly reflective of the public's mood. The Protestant Reformation took various shapes across Europe, and this very recently, albeit loosely unified Britain was running the full spectrum. Ireland was still majority Catholic, Scotland was Presbyterian Protestant, and England was a right mix. The Anglican Church was firmly Protestant but maintained Catholic-style ceremonies and administration. This sat poorly with England's Catholic and nonconformist Protestant minorities, as well as almost all Scots and Irish. A century earlier this wouldn't have been a problem, but now that Ireland, Scotland, and England were ruled by the same king, they needed to play nice. And none of them wanted to. Add to this tension that the king and parliament were now openly antagonistic, as in 1629 King Charles dismissed parliament entirely for 11 years, and when he begrudgingly brought them back to raise taxes to finance a war against Scottish Protestants, Parliament allied with the Scots against the king, defeated him in war in 1646, and executed him on charges of treason in 49. Parliament then abolished the monarchy, and for the next decade they governed the Isles as a republic. Catholic Ireland disliked the fiercely Protestant English government, and the Scots were understandably upset to hear that the English Parliament had murdered their Scottish king. So another round of war ensued. Scotland was straightforwardly beaten into submission, but Ireland was devastated, with between 10 and 25% of the population killed and all but Connaught fully confiscated by England. And this was not the first such conquest, as King James sent British colonists to Northern Ireland to establish the Ulster plantations in 1609. By the late 1600s, Ireland was blatantly treated as a colony. Not Protestant, not Britain, very exploitable. And we see that same logic applied to the Virginia colony in 1607 and other New World endeavors thereafter. Back in Britain, Lord Protector Cromwell died in 1658, and in his absence the Republic started floundering. So here's a swerve for you. They asked the king to come back. In 1660, the Stuarts returned, but they wouldn't stay for long because King James II was super Catholic. So in 1688, Parliament swerved yet again by extending an invitation to the King's Anglican daughter Mary and her very Protestant husband Prince William of Orange to, throw a coup. A coup is better than an outright civil war, but Scotland and Ireland did rebel in discontent, and England brought the hammer down hard. Meanwhile, in deposing and replacing a monarch, Parliament had all new leverage over the state, and essentially invented the concept of constitutional monarchy. The hefty political implications of that will unfold over the next few centuries, but an immediate consequence was Dutch boy William's hometown rivalry with France becoming England's business. And this geopolitical deja vu will define the long 18th century, as France and Britain compete in a second 100 Years' War, both in Europe and all across their brand new empires. Inspired by the maritime mastery of Spain and Portugal, Britain sailed across the Atlantic to snag some colonies of their own, founding Virginia in 1607 and continuing with a flurry of expeditions from the Caribbean all the way up the Atlantic coast and around Hudson's Bay. In 1664, they captured the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, and by the end of the century, Britain was running a solid operation. London and West British ports were bustling with imported furs, furs, tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Seeing the opportunity to literally grow money, Britain took a page out of Portugal's colonial playbook and began buying up vast amounts of Africans to work as slaves over in the New World. And this was the infamous triangle trade. British guns and textiles pay for slaves, who then staff increasingly massive plantations, and those crops sell in Europe for boatloads of money. Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. Africans were treated as little more than the raw materials of empire, overworked, given
I don't even think it was a little more. It probably was like a little bit less, honestly.
nothing and brutally abused. A fifth would die crossing the Atlantic, and the average life expectancy upon arrival was just 7 years. This was almost abhorrent enough to make people think twice before they remembered how obscenely rich it was making them. Slaves made money, money made armies, armies made empire. Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. In Britain, this cycle paid for improvements in government bureaucracy and overhauled all of finance with innovations like the central bank. And during the 1700s, these early successes just kept on compounding. 1702, France tries out for the Spanish crown, and Britain makes them pay for it with Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Plus, they take Gibraltar from Spain, so now Britain decides who gets in and out of the Mediterranean. 1740, Britain dunks on the French Navy because they can. 1754, British and French colonists fight over who gets North America, and 2 years later, all of Europe is throwing hands at each other. Britain's massive pocketbooks let them throw infinity money at the problem, so they take French Quebec and the Mississippi River Valley, push France out of India, and with this field to themselves, begin steamrolling all of India. The 7 Years' War doubled the size of the British Empire and knocked out every outside threat, so now they just needed to keep it together. And naturally they didn't. See, when the British imposed new taxes on stamps and tea to pay for the ludicrously expensive war they just fought, American colonists were furious to be treated like, gasp, a colony. So they started asking the philosophical questions at the heart of self-determination, such as, hey, King George, what's the opposite of tea? Yeet! Worse yet, France was egging them on, and then they got ideas. Of course, the French Revolution is a philosophical and political doozy all on its own, but what matters for us is that France threw down the gauntlet with basically everyone and conquered nearly all of mainland Europe. Britain withstood a continental trade embargo and even blocked an attempted invasion, but their greatest weapon was Napoleon's own hubris, as his empire evaporated in 1815 and the Second Hundred Years' War was firmly in the books. Point Britain. While the empire was gearing up to become the master of the world, Britain still needed to be the master of itself, and that was a tricky prospect. After the Revolution of 1688, Catholic and pro-Stuart uprisings in Ireland and later in Scotland threatened to untie the delicate knot that kept the kingdoms together. So England solved the issue by two means: legal mechanisms and violence. In 1707, England formally unified with Scotland to create the Kingdom of Great Britain, and again in 1800 to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. What was once a complex web of personal unions and technically independent states were now just the same kingdom. Nice and easy. This was enforced forcefully, as a slew of penal laws in Ireland systematically deprived Catholics of property, religious freedom, and political rights. These laws were repealed in the late 1700s and early 1800s, but as we see with the unchecked devastation of the potato famine in the middle of the century, the government still didn't really care.
Yep, I mean, we watched a whole video on the potato famine, honestly. That was a very interesting time.
All that much? As is the case from earlier, Scotland got off quite a bit easier. While the agriculture of the Highlands was entirely overhauled, with mass evictions, the complete disassembling of the clan system, and a little titch of cultural erasure, the cities in the south had a grand old time, as Edinburgh was the brains of the empire and Glasgow's ships were the heart of Britain's maritime power. And speaking of power, the turn of the century brought the Industrial Revolution, which gave Britain the tools and the technologies to single-handedly dunk on the entire rest of the planet. The advent of mechanized industry and steam power changed the lives of everyday Britons by bringing them affordable consumer goods while cramming them into cities and, in the case of the poor, factories. But that in turn made Britain the manufacturer to the world and, increasingly, its owner. With cool new gizmos like steamships, Britain could hold a network of colonies no matter how far they were. To reach the vast riches of India, British sailors could pass along Sierra Leone, St. Helena, the Cape Colony, Mauritius, and the Maldives. But by the end of the century, after the Suez Canal opened, you could pass Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Egypt, Aden, and Somaliland, and then keep going past India to Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand without once making port on a coast that didn't belong to Queen Victoria. In 1921, you could walk from South Africa to Mesopotamia and never leave British territory. The raw scope and diversity of locales at play here is frankly a...
Yeah, I forgot that was their slogan, honestly. an empire on which the sun never sets. That's actually kind of crazy. Yeah, the sun used to like never set anywhere in the like in the British Empire. That's actually kind of insane.
Absurd, as it's dizzying to distinguish what's behind this blanket of red draped over a quarter of the world. And while that diversity found its way into Britain itself through communities and art and food from all over, it raises some rather thorny questions about belonging and ownership. There was a tangible dissonance between the idea of all these disparate cultures coming together and the reality of Britain sitting at the top. Still, British and other European empires knew that outright colonization was not necessary to squeeze out wealth, and the prime example is China, which Britain ransacked in the Opium Wars to get better trading rights and a tiny little island called Hong Kong. Because why bother colonizing all of China when you can just smack them into letting you trade whatever and wherever you want? Of course, keeping these far-flung territories safe from other prying empires produced a cycle of take it now so no one else can, leading the Europeans to carve up all of Africa in just 20 years. As we know, it wasn't long before they pointed those carving knives at each other, and so the World Wars happen. Yes, they're very important, we're not getting into it. What matters to Britain is that although it did win both wars, it lost...
We have watched videos on the World War, so yes, we don't have to get into it.
Heavily in that process. Despite scoring some prizes from the losing empires along the way, it became clear that these colonies, which fought so hard for the British cause and were sometimes in the theaters of war themselves, needed the big reward. Much of the British public was for this, as the wheels of national sovereignty had been turning since Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa became self-governing dominions around the turn of the century, and the Republic of Ireland gained independence in 1922. But after the Second World War, those ideas were finally trickling out to the other colonies. So over the next few decades, the empire dismantled itself, mostly non-militarily, but very irresponsibly. As a rule, Britain didn't care where they drew the borders, nor how bad of a mess they left behind. Exhibit A, India. This continued through the
India was the worst for that too, because they really did not care about the border.
1900s and culminated, somewhat tragically, with the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Built from the ground up in the span of a century and a half, Hong Kong had an international identity and a true blend of cultures that, despite centuries of lofty ambitions, no other colony had ever achieved. Far be it from me, of all people, to bemoan the death of the British Empire, but I will mourn Hong Kong. Meanwhile, in the closing hours of the century, the United Kingdom allowed Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to form their own parliaments and govern themselves more directly. What that means for the future of Britain? We're not there yet. And that, whew, is the history of the British Empire. What it all meant and what we should take away from it are the subjects of vigorous academic and public debate. I can go on and on from my comfy top-down perspective, but the consequences of this...
To speak so top-down risks making the story as cold and analytical as a board game, one which astoundingly actually exists. You're probably right.
History
I can't think
play
of
out
Sorry, I can't think of the game right now, but he's probably right.
and the lives of billions of people in the Isles and around the world. It's constitutional government, industrialization, global...
I just thought of it, but I don't think no, I think I know. He has to be talking about civilization, right? He has to be talking about civilization. I think he is. Comment what you think he's talking about in the comment section down below.
Global networks, bitter post-colonial rivalries, treasures missing from their home cultures, and a very, very contested picture of British identity. Who belongs? Who benefits? Even just inside of Britain, that is a lot to unpack. And with the topic as broad as the British Empire, there are no universal answers. What can I say? That's Empire for you. Thank you for watching. This video was a long time coming.
Yeah, this was a crazy video. I kind of want to hear what he's going to say after.
And I hope that I was able to do some justice to a subject as broad and complex as this. Thanks, as always, to our community of patrons who support the work we do, and an extra special thank you to our community members on Discord.
Okay, so I guess he's done. But yeah, that was it. And I mean, because thinking about it, you know, the history of Britain is kind of, that's a lot to go over. But you know, so yeah, that was pretty good by Blue. And yeah, talk to you guys in the next video. Subscribe to the channel and get that. Anyways, I was just saying that yeah, it's like it's a very broad you know, part of history to learn about. So yeah, also subscribe to the channel. I want to get recommend the videos in the comment section down below. And yeah, talk to you guys in the next video, and peace.